What if the most powerful man in Europe was not a king, not an emperor, not a pope, not a general commanding vast armies? What if Europe's fate was shaped instead by a man with no crown, no throne, and no official empire, only money? A man so wealthy that, adjusted for modern inflation, his fortune would exceed $400 billion. A man whose influence decided who became emperor, which wars were fought, and even how religion itself would evolve. His name was Jakob Fugger. History remembers kings and conquerors, but behind the scenes of early modern Europe, it was bankers, men like Fugger, who quietly rewrote the rules of power. This is the story of how a peasant's grandson rose to become the unofficial ruler of Europe, and how his pursuit of wealth helped give birth to modern capitalism, while sowing the seeds of unimaginable conflict. To understand Jakob Fugger, we must first understand the world he was born into. Late medieval Europe was rigidly hierarchical. Power flowed downward from kings to nobles to clergy. At the bottom were peasants, bound to land, crushed by taxes, and largely powerless. Wealth, when it existed, was tied to land ownership and noble birth. Trade was growing, but merchants were viewed with suspicion. Lending money at interest, known as usury, was condemned by the church as a sin. In this world, a peasant becoming powerful was almost unthinkable. And yet, that is exactly where the Fugger story begins. Jakob Fugger's grandfather, Hans Fugger, was born a peasant weaver in the village of Graben in Swabia. Hans owned no land, he had no title, his life was defined by hard labor and limited opportunity. Like millions of others, he lived under the authority of local nobles who extracted taxes while offering little protection. But Hans Fugger possessed something rare. Rather than accept his fate, Hans made a decision that would change his family's destiny. He left the countryside and moved to the city of Augsburg. This was a radical act. Cities in medieval Europe were islands of relative freedom. Inside city walls, feudal control weakened, trade flourished, guilds offered paths to wealth and political participation. Hans began as a simple textile worker. He worked tirelessly, saving every coin, building relationships, and learning the mechanics of trade. Crucially, Hans understood that marriage was a business decision. He married the daughter of a guildmaster, not once, but twice. Each marriage elevated his status, granting him greater commercial rights and access to influential networks. Over time, Hans Fugger gained membership in Augsburg's powerful Merchants' Guild, officially joining the city's commercial elite. He fathered 11 children, each inheriting a highly organized and profitable enterprise. But among them, one child stood apart, the youngest. When Jakob returned to Augsburg in his mid-20s, he was no longer a merchant's son. He was a financier. He was placed in charge of the Fugger Agency in Innsbruck, Austria, an area strategically positioned near rich mineral deposits and powerful noble courts. Here, Jakob revealed how different he was from his father and brothers. Where they were cautious, Jakob was bold. Where they avoided risk, Jakob calculated it. Where they followed tradition, Jakob challenged it. Very early in his career, Jakob made a decision that shocked other merchants. He chose to gamble everything. Jakob set his sights on Archduke Sigismund of Austria. Sigismund was infamous. He lived extravagantly, hosted absurdly lavish parties, and spent money as if it were limitless. One notorious event featured a dwarf leaping out of a pie to wrestle a giant, an absurd spectacle that perfectly captured Sigismund's court. To fund this lifestyle, Sigismund borrowed relentlessly. He defaulted frequently. Most bankers refused to deal with him. Jakob Fugger saw opportunity where others saw disaster. He deliberately lent Sigismund money, not massive sums, but strategic loans designed to build trust. This relationship would become the most important gamble of Jakob Fugger's life. By aligning himself with Sigismund, Jakob gained access to something normally reserved for nobles: mining rights. Silver and copper were the bloodline of European economies. Control over mines meant control over currency, weapons, and war. Jakob understood this. He was no longer thinking like a merchant. He was thinking like a ruler. And this was only the beginning.
By the late 1480s, Jakob Fugger was no longer an apprentice merchant. He was a man standing at the edge of history. His relationship with Archduke Sigismund of Austria had already set him apart from rival bankers. But now, circumstances would force Jakob to make a decision that would either destroy the Fugger family forever or elevate them above every financial house in Europe. The moment arrived during a time of war. Archduke Sigismund's extravagant lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Austria was embroiled in military conflict with the Republic of Venice, a far wealthier and more organized power. Wars required enormous funding: mercenaries, weapons, fortifications, and bribes. Sigismund was bankrupt. His reputation was so poor that every major banking house refused to lend to him. The Archduke was politically isolated and financially cornered. Except for one man: Jakob Fugger. Where others saw a reckless noble on the brink of collapse, Jakob saw leverage. Jakob proposed an extraordinary loan: 100,000 florins. To understand how insane this was, consider this: 100,000 florins was the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars today. It represented an enormous portion of the Fugger family's total wealth. Jakob did not have this money sitting in vaults. To raise it, he mobilized every resource available, calling in favors, pooling capital, liquidating assets, and risking the entire Fugger enterprise. If Sigismund defaulted, the Fugger family would be ruined. But Jakob was not reckless. He was precise. Unlike previous lenders, Jakob imposed brutal conditions. Sigismund would not repay the loan with cash. He would not repay it with silver shipments. Instead, Jakob demanded control over state revenues, direct access to silver output, priority repayment before all other creditors. Most shocking of all, Jakob gained effective control over Sigismund's treasury. Other bankers laughed. They believed Jakob had lost his mind. No one expected Sigismund to honor the agreement. They were wrong. The loan opened doors that had always been closed to merchants. Mining was traditionally controlled by nobility. It was considered too strategic, too powerful to be entrusted to commoners. But Sigismund, indebted and dependent, granted Jakob Fugger access to mining leases across Austria and beyond. This marked a fundamental shift. Jakob was no longer financing production. He was owning it. Among Jakob's most critical acquisitions were copper mines. Copper was not glamorous like gold or silver, but it was vital. Copper was used to make cannons, ammunition, tools, and currency alloys. Whoever controlled copper controlled war. Jakob understood this before anyone else. Through strategic leases and acquisitions, the Fugger family gained near monopolistic control over Europe's copper supply. Prices rose, competitors vanished. The Fugger name became synonymous with metal and power. Jakob's most legendary acquisition came in Schwaz in the Tyrol region. There, Sigismund granted Fugger access to what was effectively the largest silver mine in the world. The impact was immediate. Thousands of workers flooded into the region. Entire towns sprang up overnight. Schwaz transformed into the largest mining metropolis on Earth in the early 16th century. At its peak, Schwaz produced more silver than any other location in Europe, and Jakob Fugger controlled it. Jakob revolutionized mining operations. He introduced centralized management, skilled specialists, standardized production, and financial oversight. Mining was no longer a medieval gamble. It became an industry. This was capitalism in its earliest true form. Jakob expanded aggressively into Antwerp, the beating heart of global trade. Antwerp connected Europe, Asia, and the New World. Spices, metals, textiles, and silver flowed through its markets. By dominating Antwerp's trade networks, Jakob ensured that Fugger goods reached every major economy. The Fugger Empire was now international. Success bred danger. When the Prince Bishop of Brixen died, the Pope claimed his estate, including Fugger investments. It was a financial disaster, on paper. But Jakob did not panic. Instead, he negotiated. Quietly, strategically, using influence rather than force. The Vatican backed down. Jakob learned a crucial lesson. Money alone is not enough. Power must protect wealth. This realization would change him forever.
By the turn of the 16th century, Jakob Fugger had achieved something no merchant family had ever accomplished. He controlled mines, he controlled trade, he controlled capital. But he had learned a hard truth during the Brixen crisis. If a pope could claim his assets, if a ruler could rewrite the rules overnight, then Fugger needed something greater than money. He needed political leverage, and he knew exactly where to find it. Archduke Sigismund had served his purpose. He had opened doors into mining and nobility, but he was unreliable, impulsive, and weak. Jakob Fugger began quietly distancing himself. Instead, he aligned himself with a far more dangerous figure. Maximilian was ambitious, charismatic, and chronically broke. He dreamed of expanding the Habsburg Empire, waging wars across Europe, securing dynastic marriages, but he lacked one thing: money. Jakob Fugger provided it. When Maximilian moved to seize power in Vienna, Fugger backed him financially. This was no small gamble. Backing the wrong claimant could result in confiscation, imprisonment, or death. But Jakob understood something fundamental. Empires run on credit. Maximilian won, and Fugger was rewarded. As repayment, Maximilian granted Fugger access to Hungary's copper and silver mines, some of the richest in Europe. Jakob reorganized them ruthlessly. New technologies, new labor systems, new financial oversight. Production exploded. Hungary became another pillar of the Fugger mining empire. In 1507, Jakob crossed a line no banker had crossed before. He purchased the lordships of Kirkberg and Weissenhorn. This elevated the Fugger family into the ranks of high nobility. They were no longer outsiders. They were aristocrats. All but in name, Jakob Fugger had become a prince. With power came resentment. Rival bankers, princes, and guild leaders despised him. They pressured Emperor Maximilian to cut Fugger out. Jakob responded not with force, but influence. He leveraged bishops, dukes, electors. Maximilian backed down. In 1514, Jakob Fugger was officially made a count of the Holy Roman Empire. A peasant's grandson now outranked centuries-old noble houses. As Maximilian aged, Europe faced a dangerous question: who would inherit the imperial crown? The leading candidate was Charles of Habsburg, later Charles V, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, the Americas. But elections were expensive, bribes were expected, and Charles did not have the funds. Jakob Fugger stepped in.
He raised 543,000 guilders, over 60% of the total election cost. This was not hidden. This was not secret. This was power exercised openly. Charles won, and he never forgot who put the crown on his head. In 1523, Jakob Fugger sent Charles a letter demanding repayment. The wording was extraordinary. He reminded the most powerful man on earth, "It is well known that without me, your majesty would not have obtained the imperial crown." This was not arrogance, it was fact. Jakob's next target was the Vatican. He became the chief financier of the Catholic Church. He handled papal revenues, donations, indulgence payments. He paid the Swiss guards, creating a tradition that still exists today. He oversaw the Roman mint. Jakob Fugger served 7 popes. He became known as God's banker. One of Jakob Fugger's most revolutionary and controversial acts was helping end the Church's ban on usury. Charging interest had been considered sinful for centuries. Jakob pushed for change. The ban was loosened. Capitalism accelerated. Debt became normal. The modern financial system was born. But progress came at a cost. Legalized interest led to predatory lending, widespread debt, and growing inequality. Resentment grew, and many blamed 3 figures: the Pope, the Emperor, and Jakob Fugger.
By the second decade of the 16th century, Jakob Fugger had achieved something unprecedented. He controlled Europe's metals, imperial elections, royal treasuries, and now the finances of God's Church. The Vatican was no longer merely a spiritual authority, it was a financial machine, and Jakob Fugger was its chief operator. The Catholic Church required enormous funding: cathedrals, art, armies, diplomacy, none larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Church needed money. Jakob Fugger had it. To raise funds, the Church expanded the sale of indulgences. An indulgence promised forgiveness of sins or reduced time in purgatory in exchange for payment. Jakob Fugger's banks handled collection, transfer, and accounting. He earned commissions on salvation itself. For many Europeans, this crossed a moral line. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. He did not attack Fugger by name, but everyone knew who stood behind the system. To ordinary people, indulgences symbolized corruption, exploitation, spiritual betrayal. The Church looked less like a guardian of souls and more like a Fugger subsidiary. Pamphlets spread across Europe. Fugger was depicted as greedy, satanic, the embodiment of moral decay. Some accused him of making a pact with the devil. Others blamed him personally for rising debt, poverty, loss of traditional livelihoods. The richest man in history had become its most hated. The legalization of interest transformed Europe. For merchants, it was liberation. For the poor, it was a trap. Debt cycles spread rapidly. Peasants lost land. Artisans lost independence. Money flowed upward. Anger flowed outward. In the 1520s, Germany erupted. Peasants rebelled against nobles, clergy, bankers. Fugger estates were targeted. Mines were attacked. Jakob was forced to deploy armed guards to protect his assets. The very system he helped build was now turning against him. What began as a theological dispute became a political earthquake. Princes saw opportunity. By rejecting Rome, they could seize church lands, escape debts, challenge imperial authority. Fugger-backed emperors suddenly faced fractured loyalty. Europe was splitting apart. Jakob Fugger remained loyal to the Catholic Church, the Habsburgs, the Old Order.
but the ground beneath him was shifting. His wealth depended on stability. Stability was disappearing. The Reformation hardened divisions. Decades later, these divisions would explode into the 30 Years' War, one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. Estimates suggest 20% of Europe's population died. Some regions lost over 60%. While Fugger did not start the war, his financial architecture made it possible. Jakob Fugger had proven that money could crown emperors, finance could rewrite religion, capital could replace armies. But he also proved something darker. Unchecked wealth reshapes society, often violently. Despite unimaginable wealth, Jakob lived modestly. No palaces, no excess. His obsession was not pleasure, but control. His motto was simple: I want to gain while I can. By the early 1520s, Fugger was aging. Europe was in turmoil. His church was fractured. His system was under attack, and history was moving beyond his control.
By 1525, Jakob Fugger was 66 years old. Europe was changing rapidly. The Reformation spread. Princes defied Rome. Economies shifted. Jakob had spent decades building the largest private banking empire in history, yet even he could not halt the tide of change. Despite this, he remained at the center of Europe's financial, political, and religious systems. He had navigated decades of wars, rebellions, and debt crises. He had controlled emperors, influenced popes, and owned mines that produced the wealth of nations. And yet, he died quietly in Augsburg, leaving an empire without a successor of equal genius. Jakob had no children of his own. His empire was inherited by his nephew, Anton Fugger, who was prepared but lacked Jakob's visionary risk-taking. Anton maintained the empire, but Europe was no longer the same. The seeds of upheaval that Jakob's loans and financial maneuvers had sown were blossoming. Religious wars, national revolts, economic instability. The empire Jakob built would endure, but in a world far more dangerous than the one he had mastered. To understand the scale of his power, in today's money, Jakob's net worth would be roughly $400 billion. He controlled silver and copper mines, banking systems, royal treasuries, and the flow of funds to the Vatican. His influence determined imperial elections, financed wars, and shaped European geopolitics. He was, for a time, more powerful than kings and emperors combined. Jakob Fugger's contributions went beyond personal wealth. He pioneered monopolies, controlling copper and silver production across Central Europe, modern banking, leveraging risk, credit, and strategic loans to shape empires, political finance, funding imperial elections and treaties, integration of industry and finance, mining, metals, and banking fused into a single operation. Without Fugger, the emergence of modern capitalism in Europe may have been delayed by decades. But wealth has consequences. Jakob's financing of indulgences angered millions. The sale of indulgences, backed by Fugger, directly triggered public outrage. Martin Luther's 95 Theses challenged the Church's corruption and, indirectly, Fugger's empire. Europe fractured along religious lines, culminating in decades of warfare. Jakob's empire was both a source of prosperity and a catalyst for conflict. Jakob Fugger's story is a paradox, a man of peasant origins who became Europe's most powerful financier, a banker who could dictate policy to emperors and control the Vatican treasury, a man of immense wealth who lived simply, a visionary whose ambition shaped the future, but whose actions indirectly contributed to war and social upheaval. Fugger demonstrated that money is not neutral. It can build,
influence, and destroy. From Fugger's life, we can learn financial acumen is power. Jakob's intelligence, strategy, and risk-taking allowed him to surpass traditional nobility. Wealth creates responsibility. Every loan, investment, and political maneuver had consequences for society. Influence can shape history. Through finance, he affected religion, politics, war, and culture. Ethics and capital. Even the most brilliant financial minds cannot escape moral scrutiny. Fugger's success brought both admiration and widespread resentment. Even centuries later, Jakob Fugger's name resonates. The Fuggerei, a housing complex in Augsburg built by the family, still in use today. Financial history. He is studied as a pioneer of banking, investment, and risk management. European history. Many credit him with reshaping the power dynamics of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. His story is a warning. Immense wealth can create immense influence and immense controversy. Jakob Fugger's life shows us that money is more than currency. It is power, influence, and legacy. He was a man who rose from humble beginnings, dominated Europe's financial system, influenced emperors, kings, and popes, helped fund the Reformation, shaped wars, economies, and political structures. Fugger's story reminds us, behind every empire, every king, and every financial system, there is often a mind that understands money like no one else. We leave Jakob Fugger as he lived, quietly determined, master of numbers, master of empires, master of wealth. Europe would never see his like again, and history remembers him not just as a banker, but as a man who changed the course of nations with nothing but coins, contracts, and vision. If you've been fascinated by Jakob Fugger's story, leave a 1 in the comments to show you stuck with us until the end. Subscribe to Old Money Stories for more tales of families, fortunes, and the hidden history of wealth that shaped our world.